Okay, so as you see, the title of tonight's presentation is Man More Than Matter? Basically, the issue at hand, and the topic of conversation is the soul of man, the human soul. Is it immaterial? Is there something more than the body to the human being? Do we have a rational, immaterial soul that survives bodily death and can actually function independent of our body? To this question, there are many who respond with an absolute definitive no, known as the materialists or the naturalists, a worldview that states there is nothing that exists beyond the material world. There is nothing that exists beyond what we can sense through the five senses, what we can perceive. Just to sort of illustrate to you how a materialist would respond to this question about the human soul, I'd like to quote for you Daniel Dennett, one of the leading atheists of today within modernity, within secular society. He's an American philosopher, writer, and cognitive scientist. He is a materialist who holds to a naturalistic worldview. And in his book, Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, Mr. Dennett writes as follows, quote, "It's this expandable capacity to represent reasons that we have that gives us a soul. But what's it made of? It's made of neurons," he says. "It's made of lots of tiny robots, and we can actually explain the structure and operation of that kind of soul, whereas an eternal, immortal, immaterial soul is just a metaphysical rug under which you sweep your embarrassment for not having any explanation," close quote. So the question is the human soul, in particular our intellect and our will, the two faculties or powers that we traditionally identify of the human soul, is the human soul simply neurons of the brain? Is the human soul merely restricted to something of a material makeup? Or are we just simply pushing under the metaphysical rug? Do we actually have an explanation for the traditional view of the human soul being immaterial and consequently immortal? And the answer is yes, and that's what this presentation tonight is for. It is a response to the common materialistic, naturalistic worldview that states man is nothing more than a combination of molecules and atoms. Nothing immaterial to man. Okay, so let's move to section 2, or part 2 of tonight's presentation, and that is the argument for the immateriality of the human soul from the human desire for and awareness of what philosophers call the 5 Transcendentals. There seems to be 5 areas or 5 things that human beings have an unrestricted desire for. A desire for unconditional, perfect, and unrestricted truth or knowledge. A desire for perfect, unconditional, and unrestricted love. A desire for perfect and unrestricted, unconditioned goodness or justice. Beauty and being. But as we're going to see, as Father Spitzer identifies it as home. And I'll read a quote from his book as he explains that. So let's kind of go through this argument in 5 steps. And the first step is just simply establishing or acknowledging that we have these desires. Okay, so we'll kind of walk through each one of these transcendentals. And so we'll start with the human desire for perfect truth or knowledge, right? Step 1 is it seems that humans have an unrestricted desire for perfect truth or knowledge, love, goodness or justice, beauty, and then being or home. So let's start with the human desire for perfect truth or knowledge. I think you will agree with me that it's a common human experience that we seem to always desire to know more. We're always seeking better answers to our questions. It seems as if we're never satisfied, right? With the answers that we get to the questions that we ask. We're always seeking a more complete form of knowledge. For example, in the field of science, any scientist will affirm this. We're constantly looking for the complete explanation of the universe, right? We're always looking for more and more details about the universe so that we can understand the universe better. Over the past, 30 to 40 to 50 years, scientists have been pouring out so much energy to try and discover the various particles of the subatomic world, right? Discovering, the molecule, then the atom, and then the proton, and the neutron, and the electron, and then the quarks, and then recently the Higgs bosons, right, is what they call it. This other particle that they had been looking for, and they finally found it. This endeavor to seek more and more knowledge. I think this is pretty evident in children, right? Have you ever had the experience, I'm sure you have, when a child asks the question, you give them what you perceive to be a sufficient answer, and what's the response? Well, why is that? Right? To which you give another response, to which they respond, well, why is that? And this series of questions could go on indefinitely if you don't put a stop to it, right? I remember the first time when I experienced this. I think I was like 12 or 13 or something, and our neighbors in the back of us who were living in the back of our house had this, she was about 5 or a 5-year-old girl, right? I think she was about 5 years old at the time. And I remember vividly as a 12 or 13-year-old, she was just asking question after question. I remember thinking, boy, do you ask a lot of questions, right? And that was my first experience of that. At the time I didn't know, but now I know, boy, that was a sign of great intelligence, wasn't it? To constantly ask these questions. So I think it's a common human experience. We have this desire to know more. But notice something. We're never completely satisfied with the levels of knowledge that we attain. We're always looking for more. And we're dissatisfied with these levels of knowledge that we attain. Now, why is that? Perhaps because we desire something more. We desire perfect knowledge, what philosophers would call a complete set of answers to the complete set of questions. Perfect intelligibility. Perfect knowledge. There seems to be this human desire for that. Okay, well, what about the desire for love? I think we can all agree. We all have a human desire for perfect love. Case in point, husband and wife not getting along. Right? A spouse fails to serve the other spouse with love, gentleness, kindness. One spouse fails to be understanding of the other spouse. One spouse fails to meet the needs. Emotional, psychological, physical, on down the list. What happens when all of these needs are not met by one of the spouses? Frustration, dissatisfaction. Notice how we're dissatisfied when other people fail to love us perfectly. We're dissatisfied. Why? Because we have a desire for perfect love. We desire a perfection of love that goes beyond the particular experiences of love in my life. And this is a good thing, obviously, because it's meant to lead us to the perfection of love, God. But in a sense, it's kind of a bad thing. Why? Because very often, what happens? A person will seek that perfect love they desire in someone else rather than God. In a finite being, right? Can that finite being give infinite love? No. And so what often happens, a person sets themselves up for failure and for depression and just constant dissatisfaction trying to find the perfect love in something that can't give the perfect love, you see? So this is a common human experience, the human desire for perfect love. Well, what about goodness or justice? I think we're all aware of the common human experience of frustration when there's a manifestation of an injustice or a lack of justice, right? Take, for example, if a parent gives a cookie to one child and not the other child. And I know this for sure with my 8-year-old, 6-year-old, almost 3-year-old, and well, not yet 4-month-old, because she can't quite experience that yet. But if I give a cookie to one child and not the other, what is the other children going to say? That's not fair, right? An expression of dissatisfaction with this lack of justice or fairness on my part. What about a professor? If a professor were to only give A's to the males and F's to the females, or vice versa, F's to the males and A's to the females, right? Simply based upon their gender. How would the other gender respond? That's not just. This is a lack of justice. So we all experience frustration with injustice or a lack of level of justice, even levels of goodness, right? Think of a boss. You might have an employer who's constantly driving his or her employees to higher levels of production. Why? Because he or she is not satisfied with this particular level of goodness. They want something more. A teacher or a parent might not be quite satisfied with a degree of goodness in a system of education, and desiring and demanding higher forms of education because they want higher levels of goodness. So it's a common human experience that we are frustrated whenever we encounter a level of goodness or justice that's what? Incomplete, not perfect. Why do we get dissatisfied for it? Because we desire that which is perfectly good and just. Listen, if I didn't desire perfect goodness or justice, I would be totally content with whatever form of government is presented to me. If I were given a tyrannical form of government and I didn't desire perfect justice, I would just be simply happy and content with it and not be frustrated with it and desire something better. You see? So we have this human desire for perfect justice or goodness. What about beauty? It's a common human experience that we're often dissatisfied with certain forms of beauty in this life, even as beautiful as they may be. I know, for example, moving up here to Wenatchee a couple of years ago and going hiking, in the mountains and in the foothills, etc. You get to one viewpoint and you look out, you've been hiking and your eyes are fixed upon the ground because you don't want to trip or fall, right? And fall off the edge of the cliff, or the mountain. And so your eyes are fixed, and then you get to a viewpoint and you look out and you're like, wow, this is beautiful. But then a couple of minutes later, what happens? Well, let's see if we can get a better viewpoint. Let's go a little bit higher, right? And we hike up a little bit higher. You get to another viewpoint. This is beautiful. After a few moments of experiencing that beauty, we want to go a little bit higher, see if there's a better viewpoint. But notice something. Even though I can acknowledge a level of beauty in that scenario, I'm desiring more and more beauty. And in a sense, even though this is beautiful, I'm dissatisfied with it. I'm not content with it. Why? Because it's not a complete form of beauty. It's not perfect beauty. I want more and more beautiful things. And so this is evident of the human desire for perfect and unconditional, unrestricted beauty. Now, this desire is a good thing because it can lead to the development of culture. I desire beauty of higher forms of beauty of sensation, so we're going to develop more and more beautiful art. I desire beauty of higher forms of ideas, so we're going to have the development of philosophy and mathematics and physics that go higher and higher in their unity of ideas. So this desire for perfect beauty is a beautiful thing, can lead to the flourishing of human culture, but in a sense, it can be a bad thing too. Why? Because we're going to constantly be frustrated and dissatisfied with these imperfect levels or stages of beauty, because we desire the ultimate, the perfect. And then finally, this last transcendental, philosophers refer to it as the transcendental of being. But Father Spitzer offers an interesting explanation of this transcendental and refers to it as perfect or unrestricted home. And that is to say, an experience of perfect harmony. As human beings, we desire to feel at home in a perfect way without any sense of alienation. Now, I cannot describe this in any way better than Father Robert Spitzer. So I'm going to share with you how he explains this human desire for perfect home. In his book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, on page 281, he writes the following, excuse me, quote, "Human beings also seek a perfect sense of harmony with all that is. They not only want to be at home in a particular environment, they want to be at home with the totality, at home in the cosmos. Have you ever felt, either as a child or an adult, a sense of alienation or discord, a deep sense of not belonging? You ask yourself, what could be the source? And you look around and see that at this particular time, you have a good relationship with your friends and your family. Your work relationships seem to be going fairly well. Community involvements have produced some interesting friends and context in which you work. Yet something's missing. You don't quite feel at home in a general sense. Yet you do feel at home with family, friends, organization, etc. You feel like you are out of kilter with and don't belong to the totality. And yet all the specific contexts you look at seem just fine. You feel emptiness, a lack of peace. Yet there is absolutely nothing you can put your finger on, close quote." Now, my dear friends, as I read that, I don't know if you personally and subjectively can affirm that, but I know I can. I've had this experience time and time again where I feel this sense of discord, alienation, something's awry, something's not right. But then I look at all my individual context, the context or the categories of my life, my wife, my children, my home, my church community, my job, my career, and everything's perfect. It's beautiful. I couldn't ask for anything better. Well, not perfect, but you get the point, right? But yet I still feel that sort of alienation or discord. I can affirm what Father Spitzer is talking about here. And so what this reveals is a desire for a sense of perfect home, where you're completely at home in the totality of things without experiencing any sort of alienation or discord. Perfect harmony, you might say. Philosophers would call that perfect being. Okay? Now, so this is step one. We have the human desire for perfect knowledge or truth, perfect love, perfect goodness hyphen justice, perfect beauty, perfect unconditional and unrestricted home or being. Now, step two has to do with the awareness of perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being. Okay? Because we have to ask ourselves, notice that, how is it that I am able to judge a particular experience of one of these transcendentals to be incomplete? When I am dissatisfied, let's say with a particular level of knowledge, when I ask a question, I get an answer, I say, that's incomplete. Notice when I'm dissatisfied with it, I'm making a judgment, this level of knowledge is not complete, right? Which moves me forward to seek higher levels of knowledge, better answers to the question that I'm asking. Now, how is it that I'm able to judge that to be incomplete? Unless I am in some way aware of what is perfect intelligibility, of what is perfect knowledge or perfect truth. There has to be some sort of awareness of a complete standard of knowledge in order for me to make the judgment, this is incomplete. There has to be a measuring rod, so to speak, right? That I am in some way aware of in order for me to make the judgment, this is an incomplete form of knowledge. Think on the contrary, if I wasn't aware of perfect knowledge or intelligibility, well, I would be completely content with any form of level of knowledge that's presented to me. I wouldn't seek which is something beyond it unless first I was aware of it, right? Think about it. You really don't know that something is a limit or a boundary unless what? unless you know there's something beyond it. As you see on the PowerPoint there, the two figures would not know that's a green wall or a limit or a boundary unless they were aware that there was something beyond it. If they weren't aware that something was beyond it, they would be totally content and satisfied with where they are, thinking that where they are is the only dimension to their existence, right? Kind of like the Truman Show. You ever saw the Truman Show with Jim Carrey? You know, he's in this dome, this fake reality, you know, and his whole life is on TV, and he thinks his existence is that, when there's a whole nother dimension of life beyond the studio that they have created for his life being viewed by millions around the world. Until he goes through the sea and he reaches the wall of the studio, right, in the boat, and he bumps into it, and he immediately perceives that's a boundary, because he has a sense and aware that there's something beyond, and he finds the door and he walks out the studio. So the point is the fact that I am able to judge my experiences of the Transcendentals to be incomplete reveals that I am aware, some way, somehow, but at least I am aware that there is a complete and perfect standard of knowledge, love, goodness or justice, beauty, and being. Does that make sense? Okay? Remember, if I wasn't aware, I wouldn't be able to judge this as an incomplete experience of the transcendental. But because I can judge it to be incomplete, I must be aware of the standard of complete, perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, being. Does that make sense? Okay? All right, so chew on that one a little bit. You know, let that one sink in. You might have to buy the DVD or the audio to try to process that one. But let's move forward to step 3 of our argument. And that is the nature of this awareness. Because we have to ask the question, well, is this awareness explicit? Is it an explicit awareness? And the answer is no, because I don't know everything about everything, right? That's obvious, okay? Just live with me for a day and you'll realize that. Or just listen to one of my talks and you'll realize I do not know everything about everything. I cannot give nor receive absolute perfect love. I'm limited and restricted in that. I cannot develop an absolutely perfect, just society, the ideal society. I'm just simply restricted in those powers. So this awareness of complete and perfect knowledge, love, justice, goodness, beauty, being, right? It's not explicit. It must be what philosophers call implicit. A sort of tacit awareness, a notional awareness is what they call it. And that is to say, it's just an implicit awareness. This awareness of complete and perfect knowledge, goodness, beauty, being, etc., and love, it's kind of like a horizon, right? A horizon that is sufficient for me to be able to judge incomplete forms of the Transcendentals, but just simply a horizon, a sort of comparison point. But it's not explicit. It's implicit. It's tacit. It's a notional awareness. It's present to me, nevertheless, but it's not explicit. Now, this leads us to step 3. Once we see that we have a desire and awareness for the Transcendentals, and this awareness, although not explicit, it's implicit, but present to me as a background, as a horizon, as a notional awareness present to my consciousness. Now we have to ask the question, which leads us to step 4, what is the origin of this tacit or notional awareness? Whence does it come? Does it come from anything in the material world? Does it come from anything of the finite order of things? Does it come from any of my experiences of the Transcendentals? And we would have to answer, no. Why not? Why is it that this awareness of complete, perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, being, why is it that that can't come from my experiences in this life? Because it's these very experiences of the finite world that are what? Incomplete. It's these very experiences that are causing me dissatisfaction, as Otis Redding used to sing, I can't get no satisfaction, right? The things of this life cannot ultimately satisfy me because they are restricted and finite. Can it come from my brain chemistry, this notional awareness of the complete and perfect of the Transcendentals? No, because my brain chemistry is restricted. It's restricted to space and time, for starters. Spatial location, my brain is here, not over there, right? It's restricted to time. It exists now, not yesterday, not tomorrow. And it's restricted to a particular molecular construction. And so it's restricted. So this notional awareness of the unrestricted and perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, being can't be from my brain chemistry. So if this awareness can't be from the experiences in this life of the Transcendentals, can't be from my brain chemistry, it can't be from anything in this restricted, finite order of things. Whence does it come? It must come from some transcendental origin. Something beyond the material world, the finite world, the restricted order of being, as philosophers would call it. It must come from something transcending that. That transcendental origin that is perfect knowledge or truth, perfect love, perfect goodness or justice, perfect beauty, perfect being. We call that reality God. So the origin of my transcendental awareness is something beyond the material world, something beyond matter. Now, this leads us to step 5 of this argument, and that is making the conclusion of the transphysical or transmaterial material nature of the human soul. How do we do this? Well, think about it. If perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being transcends the finite structure of the material world, as I just indicated, well then, my power to desire it, my power to be aware of it, must transcend the finite material structure of the world as well. How so? Why is that? Well, how could a power restricted to the finite material world, such as my brain, desire and be aware of things that transcend and are beyond those boundaries? It's impossible. Something restricted to the finite material world cannot be aware nor desire something that's beyond the material world. Matter cannot be aware nor desire something that is non-matter. And so therefore, that life-animating principle of the body, we call the human soul, which gives us these powers to desire the Transcendentals and to be aware of this complete knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, being, that soul must be transcendent as well. That soul must be beyond matter. Hence, we conclude the human soul is not matter, it is immaterial. It's not material, it's immaterial. Why? Because it gives us certain powers or functions, operations, that can desire and be aware of immaterial, transcendent things. And this is the argument that many philosophers, dating all the way back to Plato in the 4th century BC, many philosophers use this argument to reveal or establish the immateriality of the human soul. That we are not mere matter as human beings, but we do indeed have an immaterial dimension.